friends. This is the program Empire of Lies, where we discuss manipulation and disinformation in the Russian media. Empire of Fatigue, why Solovyov talks about Europe's fear. In Vladimir Solovyov's new broadcasts, Russia no longer threatens the world, it pities it. The TV host, who for years cultivated the image of a besieged fortress, now describes the West as a nervous, insecure civilization, afraid not of Russia, but of itself. This shift in emphasis reveals an important symptom. Kremlin propaganda no longer speaks the language of offensiveness. It speaks the language of survival. A world losing control, Solovyov reiterates, Europe fears losing influence in Eastern Europe. Ukraine, according to him, is merely a pretext. The West's real fear is that Hungary, Slovakia, Romania, the Czech Republic, and even the Baltic states are gradually moving away from the center. This is an attempt to turn the picture upside down, as if it weren't Russia that was losing allies and economic ties, but Europe that was disintegrating before our eyes. Thus, the war is presented not as Moscow's aggression, but as a natural process of Eastern Europe's liberation from the West. The meaning is clear. If the West loses control, then Russia is regaining its own order. This is an old imperial reflex, dressed in the rhetoric of geopolitical realism. What are the fears? You often ask this question, what do the Europeans want to achieve with this war? What are their goals? To die? They're afraid. They're afraid of losing influence in Eastern Europe. I think so. Why? Because the lost war in Ukraine, given what's already happening in Europe itself, Hungary is effectively falling away. Slovakia, Romania, no matter what anyone says, the elections showed it, even if they were cancelled. But the fact is, the people's mood is completely different. The Czech Republic has joined in. What will happen there tomorrow with the Baltic states or later, I don't know. But they are afraid. Western Europe, so to speak, loses a certain amount of control if it fails in Eastern Europe. This certainly worries them. They are ready to invest financial resources there. They are pouring them in as much as possible. Is it financially painful for them? Number. When weapons become morality, then follows a familiar ritual. Solovyov talks about the readiness of the Novaya Zemlya test site for nuclear testing, the power of the Poseidon, and the tests on the Kwajalein atolls. But for him, nuclear weapons are not a military category, but a moral one. They are proof that Russia still exists, that it cannot be written off. In this logic, there is not a threat, but a desperate belief. If we cannot catch up with the West in technology and economics, then, at least in fear, we will be first. Every phrase about hydrogen explosions isn't about destruction, but about the meaning the country seeks in strength. Russia, on Solovyov's airwaves, is a country that constantly needs to prove that it's still great, even if it's great only through its threat. Ukraine as a mirror of weakness. When the conversation turns to Ukraine, Solovyov suddenly loses his solemnity. He no longer speaks of neo-Nazis, but of peasant Nibelungs, of vulgarians copying foreign symbols. This is not the language of hatred, but of irritation, almost weariness. It's as if Solovyov is explaining to the viewer that the enemy isn't scary, just pathetic. But behind this contempt lies anxiety. Russia is tired of fighting, but it can't stop, because stopping is tantamount to admitting defeat. Therefore, a new formula is born on the airwaves. We're not winning, but the West is losing. This formula is the psychological core of contemporary Russian rhetoric, from victory to self-consolation. An empire without energy, Solovyev calls Ukrainians unmotivated, saying that they have nothing to fight with. But in reality, these words sound less like an analysis than a reflection of Russia itself, a society in which faith in an idea has been replaced by faith in television. He accuses the enemy of what he himself feels: fatigue, a loss of meaning, the cynicism of commanders, and the emptiness of ideals. In this mirror-like construction, war becomes an excuse for internal weakness. Russia, which no longer has an ideology or a future, turns the front into a mirror in which it sees its own impotence and calls it resilience. What Europe needs to understand: everything Solovyov says is not about aggression, but about the fear of disappearing. This is not about a country that intends to move forward, but about a country trying to convince itself that it still has a mission. Every story about Poseidon and nuclear testing grounds isn't about war, but about the search for confirmation of one's own significance. Europe shouldn't fear this rhetoric. It should be understood as a symptom, an acknowledgement that Russia is living in the past, where power equals force and force equals meaning. When television turns nuclear weapons into a moral argument, it's not a threat to peace, it's a signal. The empire has exhausted all other ways to feel alive. Think, analyze, draw conclusions, and don't be fooled. This was the program Empire of Lies.